Hi everybody in Psych 101. We are now on chapter 2, which is largely about the brain and nervous system. Typically this is the only video that you really need to watch, but for this chapter there's a video about Phineas Gage that you'll want to see as well. Very important. So let's get started on chapter 2. First of all, what is in your brain and even other parts of your body, such as your nervous system, starts at the microscopic level with neurons. These are nerve cells that are so small that when you were born, your brain was about the size of a grapefruit and you had 100 billion, not million, billion with a B, neurons just inside your brain alone. That's not an exact number, of course, but it's pretty close. Within these neurons, you definitely want to look at the pictures on the PowerPoint slides, because there's not going to be pictures on the exam, but it explains it better than I can in this short video. So within these neurons, you have dendrites. These are little hair or finger-like protrusions from the neuron, and that's where brain chemicals come into the neuron. The cell body is where these brain chemicals are either created or stored. The axon is where the chemical has to go across. It's a long skinny tube. Think of like axle on a car, axon. Kind of sounds the same, doesn't it? And then out through the terminals. Think of terminal like terminal is used in other ways. The terminal at the airport is at the end, and a terminal illness is unfortunately the end of life. So terminal is the end. There's a picture on the PowerPoint slide showing you exactly how this would look and how it works. Some of your axons on your neurons have a fatty covering called myelin sheath. Now, wouldn't you think the more fat that you carry around, the slower you are? Well, the opposite is true in your brain. The more myelin sheath, the quicker the brain chemicals go through the neuron. So here's an example. Your brain needs to tell you whether something you're touching is hot or sharp or something you're stepping on. The more myelin that are in those neurons, the quicker you will be able to react, like moving your hand or stepping away from something. Myelin. It not only protects the neurons, insulates it, but more importantly, increases speed. Myelin sheath. The synapse. If you can see my hands in this video, neurons are not tangled around each other. There's little space between them. That space is known as a synapse. And a synapse is a space or juncture where a decision is made. The brain chemical is either going to go to the next neuron or it's going to stop right where it is. It's all or none, or also known as all or nothing. That is referred to as an action potential. The chemical either goes to the next neuron or it gets blocked. It stops right there. You have between 72 and 75 of these brain chemicals in your brain. We're not exactly sure how many. There's some debate about that, kind of like the debate on whether Pluto should really be considered a planet. Some of these brain chemicals might in fact be enzymes, but just know that you have over 70 of them. So the chemical either goes across or it doesn't at the synapse, each juncture. All or nothing. The chemical gets blocked or it goes through. The action potential is what that means, that it either goes through or it gets blocked. That's the next slide. 4 brain chemicals that I want you to know. Your book, unfortunately, makes this too complicated. I'm going to make it simple. Serotonin, depression. If you want a little more detail, people who are depressed for no real reason, they're not using enough serotonin. So medicines like Prozac, it stops the blockage of serotonin. So here's what well-meaning people do. You have nothing to be depressed about. Like they want you to say, you know, I never thought of that on my own. Well, they don't think you should be depressed, and maybe they don't see that you lack serotonin production, that it's blocked at the synapse too often. Acetylcholine, muscles and memory. People who develop Alzheimer's, who have conditions like Parkinson's, there is definitely an acetylcholine problem among other issues. Dopamine, schizophrenia. People who hear voices and believe things that are just not true, they're using too much dopamine. So what do we want to do with medicine? Block it at the synapse. Is that what you were guessing? You're right. Norepinephrine, anxiety and panic. People who have those symptoms of anxiety and panic, they need to lower their norepinephrine. Don't worry which direction these go in. Just know serotonin, depression. Acetylcholine, muscles and memory. Dopamine, schizophrenia. And norepinephrine, anxiety and panic, and even mania. But really, anxiety and panic is what you need to know. Next thing, the nervous system, I would highly recommend looking at these PowerPoint slides and your book, is broken down like this: central and peripheral. The central nervous system consists of the brain and spinal cord. We'll get back to that. Peripheral, to the outside of. My peripheral vision is how much I can see to the left and right. Well, the peripheral nervous system is outside of the central nervous system. So here's what you need to know. The peripheral nervous system is broken down into somatic. Those are things that you can voluntarily control, and autonomic. Does that sound like the word automatic? Well, it should, because these are things that work automatically in your brain. So anything that works automatically can speed up and it can be put back to normal. I phrased it that way for you on purpose because parasympathetic starts with P and that's what puts it back to the resting level. Whereas sympathetic starts with S and that is what speeds up the process. So for example, you get scared or you decide to go for a run, your sympathetic speeds up your heart and your breathing, and your parasympathetic puts it back. People who are in really good shape, cardiovascularly, that works pretty quickly. Your heart speeds up fast, it goes back to normal fast. If you're way out of shape, you'll be gasping for air for a long time, but your heart also won't get to a higher level very quickly either. So the next few slides in the PowerPoint go over this and even have a picture of a man and showing various things including pupils dilating and sexual functioning. Yeah, we're allowed to talk about that in college. And sweating and heart rate and breathing and all of those things that work on the sympathetic, parasympathetic system. Now we get to talk about something that I think is even more interesting, parts of the brain and what they do. At the very bottom, right above your spinal cord, is your medulla. In high school, did you learn that as medulla oblongata? Same thing. We're going to shorten it to medulla. Breathing and heart rate. Obviously, if that gets damaged, you would not survive for long. You need your medulla to produce breathing and your heart rate. The reticular formation or reticular system is right above the medulla. That is responsible for your alertness, arousal, your attention span, being awake. Did you notice those are all words that start with A? That's an easy way to remember it. Then your PowerPoint has a midline or sideways view of someone and showing you where all these brain parts are. You don't have any pictures on the exam to worry about, but instead it is a good idea to just kind of know where these things are in your brain. The middle brain, corpus callosum. You have these strands of neurons that go back and forth, left to right to left, on the top of your brain, but in the middle. Honestly, under a microscope, it looks like angel hair spaghetti. It really does. If that gets cut, you can still survive, but the left and right halves of your brain can't communicate with each other. So what would happen? Well, you might pick up an object like this pen and forget what it's for. It would create a lot of confusion, but not necessarily death. In fact, some people with really bad epilepsy, they choose to have that cut because it lowers their seizures, but it creates confusion. Certainly not a good outcome, but maybe better than really bad seizures. The thalamus, right in the middle of your brain, is a relay center. And the relay center is mostly for sensory messages going back and forth, left to right, top to bottom. That is in the middle of your brain. Think of it as a bunch of red lights and green lights for sensory messages. The limbic system. All of your emotions are contained in about 5 parts of your brain known as the limbic system. Fear, anger, yes, even your sex drive is in your limbic system. Part of that is called the amygdala, and that is involved in the sense of fear that we all get. Some people get it more than others, obviously, a sense of fear. The hypothalamus, right under the thalamus, is the hypothalamus. This part of the brain, and this again is all in the midbrain, does a bunch of things for us. Regulates temperature. If you're hot, you'll sweat. If you're cold, you'll shiver and get goosebumps. It does that. It tells you when you're hungry and when you're not hungry anymore, when you're thirsty, and then when you don't need anything to drink anymore. And it also coordinates with the amygdala in a fight or flight response when you get fearful of something, afraid of something. The cerebellum is part of the midbrain, but it's in the back of your head. It looks like a piece of cauliflower if you've ever seen it in a picture. What does that do? Balance. Are you able to stand up, pick up objects, walk, and even hold a backpack maybe while you're walking? You have a good sense of balance. When people are drunk or stoned or inebriated, their sense of balance is thrown off, and that's from the cerebellum. And if they do those kinds of substances too often, that could be permanent brain damage. That's something to think about. Your hippocampus, that's another midbrain section that's responsible for memory, especially forming new memories. So one time in my in-person class, a student raised her hand. She was very excited and she said, "My high school anatomy teacher taught us that if you see a hippo on campus, that will be a new memory for you." The whole room got silent. You have to admit, even though that's kind of a silly example, it's a good one. Hippocampus, new memories. There's a slide on the PowerPoint showing where the limbic system is, how it wraps around the middle of the brain. Again, no pictures on the exam, but you have a brain just like I do. It's good to know where these things are located. Next thing, the cerebral cortex, also known as cerebrum. This is what makes us most human. We have a bigger cerebral cortex than any other animal, any other species. This is called gray matter, even though it's kind of brownish gray. It's wrinkled because you can get more surface area into the skull that way. It is so big that in humans, we separate it into 4 lobes, or 4 parts. The frontal lobe. Let's not make this more complicated than it needs to be. It's in the front. Thinking, problem solving, self-awareness of who you are and where you are, those are all frontal lobe functions. Planning for the future. Do you have work and school on the same day? Do you have to run errands or do chores? All of those things are frontal lobe functions. Parietal lobe. On the top of your head, in your cerebral cortex, bodily sensations. If a substance is that you're touching or feeling is smooth or rough or cold or warm, your parietal lobe will tell you. Occipital lobe. In the back of your head is where you process vision. Now that might sound strange because you see things in the front of your head, but it doesn't get made sense of until it reaches the back of your brain. So if that were damaged, you could survive, but you might go blind. You might have blurry vision. You might have double vision. All kinds of things could happen that would really be disruptive, even if it's not life-threatening. The temporal lobe. Okay, in class one time I said to people, "Where is your temples? Where are they?" And a student shouted out, "Oh, I think it's like the freeway in what, Val Vista or Greenfield?" Not what I'm talking about, not that kind of temple. The temples in your head are on the left and right sides of your head, and if you think about where they are, it's no surprise that it's responsible for hearing and even speech production, making sense of what people say to you and producing words that will come out of your mouth. Now, most of these kinds of brain damage, a person can survive. However, the medulla would almost certainly be deadly. But another thing that has to happen is your brain chemicals have to either get blocked when they need to get blocked, or have the chemical go through when they need to go through. And if the brain chemicals are not working appropriately, or parts of the brain are not functioning like they should, we would say the person has a chemical imbalance. And that might be a reason to put the person on medication, or if it's a brain structure problem, to do brain surgery. Obviously, I'd rather take a pill than have my brain cut open, but sometimes that is the only way. Sometimes it's necessary. So last thing on this PowerPoint slide, and then we're going to talk about the other video. Broca's area and Wernicke's area. Where your frontal lobe meets your temporal lobe is Broca's area. If this gets damaged by a stroke or anything else that a person might have, it would be hard to form words and get sentences out of your mouth. Dr. Broca discovered this. Dr. Wernicke discovered that if the brain damage is further back, like above your ear, you will have trouble understanding and comprehending what other people say to you. So, both of those brain parts are named after the doctors who discovered what damage will do to those parts of the brain. And speaking of brain damage, in addition to watching the video that you're watching now, I would highly recommend that you watch the Phineas Gage video. Since we're not in class to watch it, I have posted it on Canvas as well, and I highly recommend that you watch this because not only will it be on the test, but it's honestly fascinating. We still talk about this guy over 150 years later. He was a railroad construction supervisor who took a railroad spike through his brain. It ended up 30 feet away from him. It's a true story. Why do we still talk about him? Because he lived. He survived with that massive brain damage for 12 more years. We think now that he probably died of an infection. But anyway, that is a case study, going back to chapter 1, because his doctor got an incredible amount of information on him. But it's also a very important part of chapter 2, and if any of you go to medical school, you're certain to learn of him, one of the first documented cases of traumatic brain injury, so that will be on your exam, and I think you'll enjoy watching the video too, because it's a great learning experience. Now, last thing, chapter 2 that we're on right now, this is the first chapter where you have a rapid reflection. Think of that as like attendance points. Open it, answer it with a few words or a sentence, click submit, and the same thing with the weekly quiz that needs to be done and the weekly Canvas assignment. So we're starting to step up our game from chapter 1, and there'll be more things like this due every time. And I hope you enjoyed this chapter about the brain, and that's it for now. Take care.